Hey, thanks for joining me today at the Independent Ink with Mr. Fish. What follows is a conversation I recently had with Chris Hedges, who has been a journalist for many years, has written some terrific books on the state of the world and how we function and dysfunction as a society. I've been the illustrator for his columns for many years, and you can find his work now at the Chris Hedges Report on Substack. So here it is, my conversation with Chris Hedges. Hey, Chris. Thanks for
Hey, how are
taking
you,
the
Dwayne?
time to chat. Yeah.
Sure.
So I know that we're busy. I know that you got to get out there and do what you can to save the planet. So let's just jump right in. I wanted to start generally. We sort of know who you are. We know what you've become, but I've always been curious a little bit about what was the culture that created you as a young person? Was there a culture that created you as a young person and
Yeah, very
inspired
much
you?
so. I mean, I grew up in the church, as you know. My father, who was a World War II vet, he had been in North Africa in World War II, was very involved in the anti war movement against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement. He was a Presbyterian minister. My mother was a seminary graduate and a professor, so steeped in the religious left. Now that's the not the liberal church. They came out of the social gospel. My father was a member of Concerned Clergy and Laity Against the War, which was started by Phil and Dan Berrigan, uh, who burned draft records at Catonsville and went to federal prison. So that was really very close to the Catholic worker movement. And I've never deviated from that. It's really the belief that as a Christian, you're called to stand with the crucified of the earth, with the full understanding that if you truly stand with the oppressed, you're going to end up being treated like the oppressed. Yeah, and I'm very thankful for that. And of course, went to divinity school in many ways to be a minister like my father, but I was a writer, clearly. Um, and yeah, I was, grounded in that, what we call the social gospel. Was very popular or very big at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, and then especially after World War One, with the repression against the left, led by Woodrow Wilson, you saw big money, Rockefellers, Carnegies, just pump tons of money into institutional churches to crush the social gospel. And they largely succeeded, but remnants of it remained, and that's what I was raised in.
And what was the overlap at that time in history between the Catholic workers and the church and the radicalism that you're speaking of with the communist party here in the United States?
What's really interesting, Dorothy Day. So when the Red Scare started in the 50s, Dorothy Day would go to rallies with Gus Hall, who was the head of the Communist Party USA, in defense of him and in terms of free speech. She herself called herself a Christian anarchist, which is kind of what I call myself, as she had been a part of the Communist Party. So there was a lot of linkage between the radical uh, social gospel, they were socialists. These were figures like Rauschenbusch. But Eugene V. Debs, people forget that Debs, the socialist candidate, uh, quoted the Bible a lot more than he quoted Marx. He hardly quoted Marx at all, actually. He knew Marx, but uh, so this was the abolitionists. I mean, this was a religious movement, uh, and yeah, so there was, I would say, collaboration might be the best way to put it, but people who come out of that Christian radicalism have some pretty strong divergences with Marxist Leninists, not least of which is over violence, but also a very dark view. I mean, I think if you look closely at Marx's vision of a society, I find it utopian, that the state will wither away, and we just have a much, much darker view of human nature than they do. Um, and we don't believe the utopia is ever going to come. That fighting against social injustice or radical evil is a never-ending battle. It was there before we came into the world and will be there after we're gone. but our call is to battle against it with the full understanding. I think this is also a difference with Marxism, that the empire always wins. It always wins. Sometimes empires fall, but then others rise to take its place. And that's what, when Max Weber writes Politics as a Vocation, his great book on the necessity of political involvement by the citizenry, in it, he said, the moment you turn your back, every gain that you made, and we made many gains in the 1960s, then the ruling elites will chip away at it if you're not vigilant, which is what's happened to us. So that's what he meant as a vocation. It's a constant, never-ending battle to protect yourself from the centers of power, and in particular, the capitalist centers of power.
And so speaking like that, and I agree with you. I start to ask that question of and I know that you've addressed this from time to time. The question of, is this a question of politics and culture, or is it a question of the human being and human behavior? Is this something? Is there a strategy or a hope that eventually, our kinder angels will eventually win out over these draconian monsters that seem to be able to organize societies in such a way that the hierarchy is being controlled by this cabal or this tiny fraction of human beings that is the most inhumane.
Well, it is all about organization. That's why the social gospel movement was so involved in the building of labor unions, supporting labor unions. Actually, the Chautauqua movement, which was part of the social gospel, which unfortunately at the turn of the century was segregated, we should be clear, but it ran the largest prison education program in the country. And as you know, I've taught in the prisons in New Jersey for many years. No, I think it's an understanding that one creates alternative centers of power, which only comes through mass movements and largely through labor, because the only weapon we have collectively to hold power in check is the strike, which is why the capitalist classes work so diligently to take it away from us. And they've largely succeeded, and that's left us powerless. I mean, I just read there's a column, editorial in the New York Times I just read about resistance. They don't get it. I mean, politics is a game of fear. Politics is a game of pressure. I know, as a reporter, I covered it for many years. If you can't create pressure, then you can't exert any kind of real influence on power. And that comes through, the ability to shut the country down. I was just in London not long ago visiting Roger Hallam in prison. He's serving a 5-year prison sentence. He founded Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and they shut down the M25 motorway around London for 4 days, which really disrupted the commerce of the city. That's what we have to do. Of course, that's why he's in prison for 5 years.
I understand though that he's actually coming out soon, so that's
Yeah. So under the British system, you get a 5-year sentence. The British prison system is a mess. It's severely overcrowded. It's nonviolent crime. So yeah, he should be out this summer, I think. So yeah, he won't have to serve the full. Well, he was supposed to get out earlier, and they revoked it. So who knows? He did get a 5-year term, but yes, under the British system, you don't have to serve the whole 5 years.
so. Speaking like that, we're talking about systems of organizations for human beings, right? And so, what the through line for what we're talking about is organizing people around economic systems. So my question is it possible to have an economic system that can be fair?
No, I mean, in that sense, that's why I describe myself as an anarchist. Power is always the problem. And so, as you as an artist, me as a writer, I think you're always in opposition in power, because power is always screwing somebody. Uh, and so, for those of us who stand with those who are being marginalized or even persecuted, which exists in any power system, that puts us in opposition to power. That makes us eternal heretics. I don't think that, I mean, obviously I'm a socialist, so there are systems that I support and that I would try and build. Um, but I think it's really, really important if you are an intellectual, a writer, an artist, that you always stand outside those systems to hold them in check, to provide the kind of self criticism that all systems of power need. And the more you dilute centers of power, the less repressive it becomes. I mean, you see this with the Trump administration. The imperial presidency was created before Trump, but now it's being used as a cudgel to just destroy, every democratic institution and all government agencies. Head Start, Meals on Wheels. I mean, this is insane. Of course, all the climate scientists are being fired, and Consumer Protection Bureau, and um, so yeah, we always have to stand outside power.
And I see that in your work, and that's one of the things that makes you not just a journalist, because I do know that a great portion of your day is reading yourself to sleep, and I know that you read an enormous amount of books.
Not as much as Cornel West. He always makes me feel illiterate.
Yes.
Or Susan Sontag, who I know. But
Oh,
yeah, I read a lot.
yeah. So, it seems obvious, that fact, because quite often in your writing, it seems that when you are attempting to make the salient and grand point that we're all human beings, and that as soon as we recognize the fact that we're all vulnerable and that we all should figure out how to be empathetic and support each other, you draw quotations from poets, playwrights, people who exist outside of just straight journalism. In fact, I think I understand too that Orwell was one of your great
Yeah,
influences.
Orwell was huge. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have somebody who has that kind of a mind, who is able to write fiction, and then also is a great journalist. And the parallels that I see between those two things is I think that the job of a journalist, we've heard it's the person who creates the first draft of history, and the idea is that you're looking for what is the real story here, and you're trying to figure out perhaps the most objective way to present that to a group of readers. And I think an artist's job is to do a very similar thing and say what is the real story here, but you're presenting it from a subjective point of view.
I would
And
say that the definition of it now, within the journalistic profession, there are many types of journalists, but I would say a real journalist holds power to account. That's what I always have tried to do. You can make quite a good living being a stenographer to power. I mean, there are all sorts of people at the New York Times have won all sorts of awards doing that. For me, that's not, you're a courtier, you're not a journalist, although you're defined as a journalist. And objectivity is I would prefer just something more basic, like to tell the truth. Uh, Objectivity has and balance and all this stuff has really been used in the hands of the commercial media to dilute the truth. So and there is truth. I mean, it exists. I mean, we as journalists, I take a more cynical view. I did it for many, many years. We manipulate facts. So I can take a set of facts and spin a story any way you want. If I'm a good careerist, I'm going to spin it in such a way that the power structure is pleased. I mean, you look at the recent report that Harvard released on anti Semitism and Islamophobia, and if you look at the report, it's clear that the people who really feel persecuted and will not express their opinions are the Muslim students, not the Jewish Zionists. And then you read the account of the report in the New York Times, and it's not factually incorrect. It's just selected. They've selected facts that buttress their stance that all of these encampments and all of this movement against the genocide is anti-Semitic, which of course it's not. Being against Israel, I mean, this is just basic, is not anti-Semitism. But there you have the facts are correct, but the thrust of the story on that report is completely mendacious and wrong, because there's no question that the brunt of the persecution and the brunt of the fear on campus is felt by Muslims, not by Jews. And of course, a significant percentage. I was in the encampments at Columbia, and Princeton, significant percentage of those students were Jewish. I mean, up, probably, I'm guessing about 30%. I mean, and it was very moving. On Friday nights, the Muslim students would hold their prayers, and then the Jewish students on the same tarp would hold Shabbat, which is the kind of society we want to build. But the way these movements were characterized and demonized, it wasn't even, it just, for me, the failure was reporting. I mean, just go there and spend a day there. I spent many days there and just report it. It was a lie. But they never even, I mean, talking about my old employer, the New York Times, they never even bothered. And that was also true in Occupy. They just ridiculed Occupy. And finally, I called up the executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, who I was hired with. And I said, Dean, just send a reporter down for the day and write a story, which he did, to his credit. And it was a good story, because the way Occupy was characterized was as false as the way these encampments have been characterized. But you don't pay a price for that because the power centers want it portrayed that way. So even though it's a lie, not only do you not pay a price, you're probably rewarded within the institution for it.
Right. Well, that begs the question then, where can we have this kind of communication where the long arm of, bureaucracy has no influence? Because it's always been my experience that I tend to go to the artistic community to figure out, what the beating heart of this thing really is. If you send somebody like, August Wilson to go write about something here, about an encampment, about an injustice, and this is the argument that I would have for George Orwell. You put somebody into that situation that is used to trying to figuring out what is the human story here outside of all the different codifications of how we classify ourselves in different ways. So is it your perspective that something is lost in the culture currently by not having artists as involved in national debates about politics and culture and who we are and where we're going? Because it certainly is mine, and I am curious to what your perspective is because you're married to an artist. I
Yeah.
work with you. You work with Joe Sacco. So what is it about this kind of personality that ultimately has the agency that journalism may not?
Well, I mean, two things. First of all, journalism is a skill which most artists don't have. I think good artists, are perceptive. You're certainly in that case, and they see the undercurrents. I mean, I love that quote. I think it was the Weimar painter Grotz, where he painted these grotesque capitalist pigs with their prostitutes and hookers and some big cigars. And somebody once stopped him and said, "Well, I don't see any of that." And he said, "That's all I see." So I think it's a matter of vision. But journalism also requires, it's not brain surgery, but it does require certain skills that most artists don't have. So I think artists can be perceptive, and oftentimes capture undercurrents and movements that exist below the surface, including resentments and feeling. All of that is true. Um, and they can often express it in their art. But I don't know many artists that I would consider good journalists. Journalism is, uh, its own peculiar form. So I think you need both. I mean, I think you need good journalists. Orwell was a very fine journalist. Um, I mean, a lot of great fiction writers were good journalists. Dickens, of course, but even like Russell Banks. Russell was a friend of mine, and he would just, I mean, he read in the paper about all these people have been charged with sex crimes, sex offenders, and they couldn't live in any neighborhoods. They were living under a bridge in Miami. So he just went down under the bridge with a notebook and just started interviewing hours and hours, and then wrote a novel about it.
Right.
Um, so, uh,
There's
I mean,
also an argument to be made, just really quick, about the new journalism movement from the 1970s. I think
well,
that putting
that was, yeah, but that was a matter of style. So if you looked at like Hunter Thompson or Tom Wolfe, they were journalists. They were very good journalists, but they were also very good writers. So, but they had very strong journalistic skills, especially if you look at Hunter Thompson's first book on the Hells Angels. That's a really masterful piece of reporting, as is the electric Kool-Aid acid test. I mean, so these people, they were very good. I mean, I care about writing, so that's the marriage of the two skills. But you're still tied to nonfiction, and uh, and an artist is not.
Right. I would say one thing that an artist has the ability to do, and if you just look at something like The War Prayer by Twain, create a serviceable metaphor that people can understand and adopt and be reminded about, what their sensitivities are. Because I think as somebody who is a spectator to art, you're looking for that. You're looking for metaphor. You're looking for things that you can then apply to your life in a way that is, again, serviceable to your humanitarianism. And I would say that that's what scripture is. I would say that if there's any merit to any religious writing, I would argue that it's for the ability to create shorthand for giving a shit about who we are and where we're going and what we
Yeah,
do.
I mean, and this is something that's true both for religious thought and for art, is that you're grappling with non-rational elements cannot be empirically measured: love, grief, death, the search for meaning, the struggle with our own mortality. Uh, as Freud said, he could write about sex, he couldn't write about love. And so I think artists do that, and I think religious thinkers also grapple with those issues, imperfectly, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but they grapple with them, and that what is constitutes, when you pay fealty to those, let's call them non-rational uh, realities. When you pay fealty to them, then that creates a complete life. And those who essentially shut those things down, like Donald Trump, are just very stunted, deformed human beings. The Buddhists say you can memorize as many sutras as you want; it will never make you wise. And I think if you go back to the origins of any religion, it is intimately intertwined with art.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think, again, one of the things that is really, well, let me ask it this way. What is your process when it comes to uh, figuring out A, what you're going to write about, and B, how you're going to write about it, and perhaps even the final question with that is what your expectation is uh, as far as your reader, given how you're going to approach it. Because you've been accused many times as painting a very bleak picture, and there's some people that see that as as hopelessness, while there's other people that see it as being frank, blunt, and inspiring. Because if you can see the problems for what they are, that's the only way you're going to be able to strategize on how to protect yourself and the people that you care about, and by proxy everybody else.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you can't see it, it's not my job to sell people hope. There's many institutions and people who make good money doing that. That's my job, to portray reality as accurately as I can see it. And if it's bleak, it's bleak. I mean, Gaza. I don't see any way out. I think uh, the Israelis will probably ethnically cleanse Gaza. I don't like it. I mean, it's horrible. But I don't see any impediment. I don't see any impediment to Trump's authoritarian state. Certainly not the Democratic Party. We don't, what's the mechanism? If with the DOJ is controlled by Trump sycophants and won't enforce rulings by judges, then it's just a kind of rearguard action. So, yeah, you can't confront despotic power if you're not frank about understanding it. And I just don't. I mean, I spent 20 years covering war. I just don't share the culture's mania for hope. I don't. That's a very childish way of looking at the world. Uh, and uh, and really typically American. But there's a kind of infantilism that goes along with it.
So what do we need then it's not so much hope, I guess, that that I want to talk about as much as framing these kinds of questions and these kinds of crises in a way that is outside of politics.
Well, empathy. It's empathy. I mean,
Right.
this
So
is why.
how do you exhibit that to a group of people who need to be reminded that they should be
Well,
empathetic?
you either have it or you don't. I think a good artist, as you mentioned, Eunice as an actor, actors have to inhabit the realities of other people if they're any good. Well, that requires tremendous empathy, um, and that empathy allows them to step into the shoes of another, especially someone who's persecuted, and see the world from their perspective. Um, I don't. I think that I think probably it's very difficult to teach empathy, but people can. I mean, this is why it's important to live outside the United States. People can live in other cultures, and language is important. So, I speak a few languages. If you have a linguistic fluency and you're living in another culture, then you can begin to see, because every culture looks at reality differently. Then you can begin to see the world from their perspective. But most importantly, it allows you to critique your own culture. But you can't do that unless you're bicultural. And most Americans are monocultural. They don't speak another language. 50% of all Americans don't have another passport. And then even when they leave the country, they're on some cruise ship or bus or, I mean, I used to see it in Egypt. They have virtually no contact with the civilization or the country that they're visiting, other than in terms of obsequious, people who carry their bags and cook their food. Yeah, I think that empathy is key. Ignorance, or the way Muslims are demonized, the way Palestinians are demonized, is easy when you've never been in their culture and you don't speak Arabic and you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, it always, as an Arabic speaker, it always stuns me to hear all these people talking about the Muslim world where I spent 7 years. They've never been there. Christopher Hitchens used to do this. He didn't know what he was
Right.
talking
Yeah. So, and even like the black experience here in the States,
about. Yeah, of course.
so yeah. So again, like where do those narratives get presented to people who don't understand them?
Well,
Because,
that was what, DEI and critical race theory was all about. It was about creating a multicultural democracy, which we should have. So, understanding that the American experience was something very different if you were a African American or a black person living in the South, or a black person living in Camden, New Jersey, which when I was writing the book with Joe Sacco was per capita the poorest city in the country. So, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be someone who's disabled? What does it mean to be Latino? What does it mean to be undocumented? There are many ways of experiencing the reality of the United States, but of course, this is now what the Trump administration has made war on. There's only one way, and it's, of course, the white supremacist, the deification of the quote unquote founding fathers, and the shutting down of other perspectives. And these other perspectives are vital for an open society, because especially if you're white, male, and come out of the power structure, you don't see it. I mean, power is, as Shakespeare illustrated in King Lear, is blindness. It's the inability to see. And when you strip away all of those structures of power that you take for granted, or that you assume is your birthright, or is because you are an exceptional human being, when you take all that away, then it opens up your ability to see. And that's what unconscious civilizations are totalitarian wastelands, and the goal of any totalitarian or authoritarian state is to make people unconscious, which is what's happening. That's why the assault on education is so fierce.
right. And the assault on the arts. I keep bringing it back to that because I think it is significant the fact that you have worked with Joe Sacco before, and you're getting ready to work with him again, and
Yeah, I
again,
mean, Joe's, we should be clear, Joe's a very, very fine journalist. He has very finely honed journalistic skills.
yeah, but the language that he communicates with is with images. So
Well,
that when
both. I mean, he has a lot of writing. I mean,
oh, no,
he
no, no,
has
no,
both.
I
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah.
I know, but ultimately, when you have, it's the same thing with like somebody like Spiegelman and Maus. There's writing, there's text involved, but there's something that is communicated with
Yeah,
images that,
without question.
yeah, that is non-lingual.
Yeah, but I would say that makes Sacco kind of unique in that he's a really fine journalist. I mean, he studied journalism, and then when I met him, I had never read his work, didn't know who he was. We were interviewing together in Bosnia, this was 30 years ago. And I said, "Who's this guy? He's a really, I mean, I know a little bit about journalism. This guy's really good." So that's what, and he does these, he also does other stuff. He does satire and all sorts of stuff. But his journalism is really his, like footnotes in Gaza or Palestine or Garage to Safer. These are really fine pieces of journalism, which, of course, as you point out, are accompanied by images.
Yeah. Yeah, so that instinct for caring, we began the conversation with you talking about your family and your father in particular, and the desire to, it seems, just to figure out, what injustice is, what love should look like, all of those things. I still am curious, you being a child of, gosh, the '60s,
Yeah,
as a
I was a
child.
child. I wasn't,
A child, literal child. Yeah, I'm not
yeah,
saying
8 or 9.
anything beyond that. So, as a child, I'm curious about any other touchstones that you had. Did you read comic books? Did you have a favorite TV show or anything, or what kind of information were you taking in, and how were you taking it in?
No, we didn't have a TV, and I didn't read comic books. Uh, the information I took in was because I went with my father to anti-war demonstrations, civil rights marches. In 1968, our house was a way station for yippies who were hitchhiking to Chicago. And, I'd come downstairs and there'd be all these bearded guys sleeping on the floor of the living room. So uh, I came out of the radical left in the 60s. Now, my father hated the drugs and he hated the Weather Underground. Was when the SDS broke apart and went underground in this insane idea of replicating, what Che Guevara called the FOCO theory, where you build a radical underground movement and start a revolution, but which is a complete actual myth within Cuba. That's not the way it happened. But a lot of people fell for it, including the SDS. So he hated that spin towards violence or that deviation towards violence on the part of the radical left, and he hated the drugs. So it was an interesting way to experience the 60s. And then again, it was clergy. So when we went to these demonstrations, he would wear a clerical collar with all of his other clergy, which, interestingly enough, probably a huge percentage of them were combat veterans from World War II, which is why he went into the ministry and they did. So they knew violence. They'd seen it. Um,
And you've read a
so
great deal of history at that time too for yourself, right? I mean,
I
has
read,
that always been a fascinating thing for you?
yeah, I mean, I read everything, but I was definitely a reader. I'm the first poem, I'm embarrassed to admit I memorized, probably as about 10, was Charge of the Light Brigade by Tennyson. One of the first books I read was called Count von Luckner, the Sea Devil. I don't know how old I was, 10 or 11, which was about this German in World War One. Like, he would take British shipping in the Mediterranean, but then he wouldn't kill anybody. He'd put them on. I don't know. It was a dumb book, but I mean, all that stuff. I love Steinbeck. Yeah, I was definitely geared from the beginning towards reading and writing. Even when I was 4 or 5, I got my mother, before I could read, to type up a book of stories. I wrote stories, I wrote poems. I just wrote incessantly, even as a kid. I was about 7 or 8 and decided to write a novel on the life of a penny, and then got about 36 pages into it, couldn't think of anything else. And I mean, it was garbage, of course. And then as a teenager, I love Faulkner, so I used to try and write stories that try to sound like, Go Down Moses. That was, of course, a complete failure. Yeah, poetry. I mean, I memorized a lot of poetry. I think a lot of writers memorize. So I memorized tons and tons of poetry.
And you had started also. You understand that you did you start a underground newspaper when you
In
were?
Yeah, so I went to prep school. I'm embarrassed to admit on scholarship, and I started an underground paper. Well, it was really so I put on the school blazer and tie and went into the town, Windsor, Connecticut, and collected quite a significant sum of money, a few $1,000s. Well, okay, I also stole letterhead from the school, so and with advertising rates, and then so it was published at a printer. I mean, I had an underground paper, and the administration went berserk, and they banned it, and then they even ordered faculty if they found copies to confiscated it and throw it in the trash, and then they put me on probation. So, yeah,
Do you have any copies?
I do.
Oh
It
my
was
gosh,
called so the official school paper, which was just a piece of shit, used to impress alumni and the parents, was called the Log, and my paper was called the Grog, and the school symbol was a pelican, and so the emblem on my paper was a drunk pelican over a big, beer stein.
so great.
I got in a lot of trouble. I was in New York once, and they handed out these flyers in Times Square for a massage parlor. It was called the Library with 7 beautiful librarians to service you. I published that as an ad in the back of the paper. That did not go down too well with the administration.
Oh, that's so
I
great.
mean, the other thing is that my best friend delivered the newspapers in the morning, and he had access to the faculty lounge, so he pilfered all the memos to the faculty, which I then religiously reprinted within my newspaper. They were also furious about that, and they couldn't figure out how I got them.
So that again, like that impulse to be disruptive in that way is, I think, is really important. And I wonder if that kind of quote unquote lawlessness is missing from the movement. I think, has it been your perspective at all? Just talking to young people, there are young people who know how to get involved and want to get involved. There is also a huge percentage of that demographic that has been conditioned to be uncomfortable to stand up, to even gather in a
Well,
public
yeah, but that
space.
depends. That's a class division. So I mean, sure, if you're
Right.
headed for Bard College or wherever, you're not going to stand up. But the students I teach in the prison, they stand up right and left. I mean, they're certainly as bright as any students I've taught at Princeton or anywhere else. They just happen to be in a prison. They don't. I mean, the world offered them nothing, and they entered the illegal economy and got for their families what they couldn't get any other way. And I relate totally with them. I mean, if I was them, I would be in prison too.
Yeah.
Uh,
100%.
so
I
they're out there. They are there. They're not. I mean, we condition kids. You in order to get into these elite schools, you can't do anything wrong. I mean, you can never turn around and tell a teacher to go fuck himself, or you can't. You have to do everything right, every score right, every AP. Well, by the time you get there, you're broken. I mean, you're completely. You define yourself by authority, or you allow authority to define you, and that's very destructive. So I've taught at Princeton, Columbia. I mean, these kids are very bright, but they're weak. Most
well,
students I
these
teach
are,
in prison are not weak,
yeah.
and they're just as
Well,
bright.
yeah, and the universities and colleges, they're just indoctrination centers for people who want to be careerists.
Well, the kids have a lot of pressure. I mean, the biggest major at Princeton and Harvard is computer science. So because in theory that's where the jobs are, although now these kids are not getting work actually. So yeah, it's all careerism, careerism, careerism. That's always been true at these elite schools. I mean, that's never changed. These institutions like Princeton or Harvard, they were created to train the plutocracy, and they still are.
It's
That's why they exist.
it's interesting you say that, because for a number of years for the SPJ, I was the only judge for cartoons in school newspapers. And every year it was the same pattern. I would get a good number of submissions, and I would look at these cartoons from Yale and Harvard and these Ivy League schools, and they were terrible. Not only were they not drawn well, but the commentary was ridiculous. It was all just sequestered inside these privileged, white people problems, and the community colleges and colleges I never heard about. These were the people who knew what was going on. So I guess that's isn't there a quote? There's somebody who said that the only people who understand the economy are the very very rich and the very very poor. And some people in the middle are just conditioned to survive and accept it as this truism that they cannot step outside of. So
Yeah,
that
I
brings
mean, so
us.
I mean, the Harvard Crimson is a piece of garbage. I mean, if you want to see a good college newspaper, go to the University of Texas or the University of Missouri. I mean, they're very
Well, is
good.
this something too that you might be facing? Is it so as a practicing journalist who's doing the real work of journalism? Uh, is it now becoming the case that the mainstream of the dominant culture is being conditioned out to knowing what good journalism is? So you just sound like a crank. Is that do you get
I,
that
I,
sensation? Because who
I
goes
mean,
to? I mean, people can say, "Oh, I keep up with the news. I read the New York Times or I watch
I read the New
MSNBC."
York Times, but
Yeah, I think everybody sort of that's the place that you can deviate from or look for what is the underlying truth about what this newspaper is really trying to say.
I mean, most people are passive consumers of news, probably 90%. So whatever they're fed, they will swallow. Those people who are proactive, who will take the time to uh, look at reporting from other sources, that's a smaller percentage. I mean, not a huge percentage. If you really want to understand what's going on, you have to be proactive. I mean, my case is I tend to read by bylines, so I know who's a good reporter, who isn't. And the New York Times coverage on Gaza has been appallingly bad. The New York Times coverage on the encampments has been horrendous. Uh, but I know because I spent time in 7 years covering Gaza. I spent a lot of time in the encampments. But if you haven't experienced those realities, how do you judge? How do you know? Um, so it's, I mean, but the commercial press has always been bad. I mean, I remember talking to Sidney Schanberg, who was a friend of mine, who was in the movie The Killing Fields in Cambodia. Anyway, Sidney said, we may not make things better, but the best we can say of mainstream journalism is we stop things from getting worse. That's probably fair. But the alternative media, the renegades, the I.F. Stones, who've been outside the system, the Orwells, George Orwell.
Hmm.
I mean, I would hear admiration for Orwell in the New York Times newsroom, and I go, they would have never let Orwell write for the New York Times, not in a million years.
Right.
But these are the real journalists.
And so, do you see independent journalism and that sort of voice getting an opportunity with technology, or is this
Well,
just
I mean, not
siloed?
if you write on Gaza. I'm slammed with algorithms. Every time I do a show on it, it's demonetized. My Twitter account magically stays stuck at 254,000, and then it adds, followers, and then the followers magically disappear, goes right back to 254,000. You think they could get an algorithm that would fool me a little better. Um, uh, so the censorship on the part of the large media platforms is quite heavy, especially on the genocide. Uh, we can get out, but we're clearly targeted, and you know, we don't want that kind of censorship power in the hands of people like Musk and Zuckerberg and others. But it's there, and so with a flick of a switch, they can shut us down. But they clearly go after us. I mean, I had a show on RT America, and when they uh, shut down RT, the 6 year archive of my shows was removed from YouTube. It disappeared, just gone. Not one was on Russia, by the way. I mean, they
This I know.
disappeared things like my show on the 100th anniversary of the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses, which I'm sure got a large following of about 10.
So I guess that brings us. I think a good way to end the conversation then is: do you foresee a strategy moving forward, A, for yourself, and B, for society to develop a hunger or a thirst for people who are attempting to do the greater good? What would that look like? How do you get them involved? And what does that involvement look like to them? What do they need to do, and what do we need to keep doing?
Well, we need to organize mass movements built around labor. That's the only way to protect ourselves. There, voting, forget it, uh, or waiting for the midterms, or thinking Trump's going to implode, or this is just suicidal. Um, I mean, because I'm so outspoken on Palestine, look, we see where this is going. Uh, the Israeli Zionist state has tremendous influence in terms of who is targeted and who is censored. I'm clearly on the list. I think it's probably terminal in the sense that they'll shut me down the way they shut down Richard Medhurst and others. And I mean, that's where, you can say that's bleak. Well, yeah, I guess it's bleak, but it's better to be prepared. I'm not going to stop speaking out. And if I did, it wouldn't matter anyway. They're hardly about to forgive me after decades of slamming the apartheid state of Israel. So, as this progresses, I think it's really ominous for people like me, you, I mean, all of us. Um, there's a wonderful, very obscure novel written in 1937. So Joseph Roth is a great journalist who I like. He was Austrian, actually. He wrote a couple novels, Radetzky March, and but in the early 20s, he immediately called the Nazis out for who they were. I mean, he got it. And so it's 1937, and the walls are closing in. And his Roth's girlfriend, I forget her name, she actually wrote the novel. And but the Roth is a figure in the novel, and it's this collection of intellectuals and artists and journalists and Jews and communists, all the people that the Nazis had targeted for eradication. And she quotes the Roth figure as saying, "I feel like a mouse squeaking against an avalanche, but squeak I must." And that's kind of how I feel. He also had a great. He left Germany. The Nazis hated him, so he left the country as soon as Hitler came to power. He went to Paris and lived in tremendous poverty because they banned. He was quite a successful author and journalist, but of course he wrote in German. And once the Anschluss came and they took over Austria, he just didn't have any mark. He couldn't. They wouldn't publish anything he wrote or any. All of his books were banned. And a friend of his who was Jewish, they were both Jewish, asked him why, was admonishing him for drinking so much. He said, "Why do you drink so much?" And Roth's answer, "What, you think you're going to survive?" So I would rather deal with that kind of uh, hard-nosed, dark view of what's coming if it's true, rather than live in some kind of fantasy land.
Is there a strategy?
You're emotionally better prepared.
Right. I just am curious about your perspective on: is there an opportunity for a cultural movement to help balance things out in our favor?
Well, I mean, the problem is that authoritarian states are very good at inculcating fear, and fear engenders paralysis. And everybody falls into this uh, self delusion that if they quote unquote keep their head down, as you saw what the universities did. I mean, Columbia is the perfect example. We'll give them everything they want. We'll, turn our Middle East department over to receivership. We'll, fire Catherine Franke. We'll, ban protests. We'll put the whole campus under police lockdown, which it is, and we'll get our 400 million back. Well, they didn't get it back. In fact, they hit them with with more suspension of grants. Well, that's just a complete misreading of power. If you can't read power correctly, uh, you're just going to get walked all over. If you read power correctly, you can actually mount effective opposition. You may not win, but at least you'll make it difficult for them.
Can you mount an opposition that is it's not ignorant of power, but it's dismissive of power? And I ask that question because a lot of people have made the comparison between now and the McCarthy era, and those real fears that were, being, perpetuated by power at that time. So then you have the counterculture movement, and you have the feminization of society, and you have black rights being forced, and all of these things
Yeah,
to
but
me.
that came after McCarthy.
Well, yes, I'm just attaching it as something that came out of the 1950s. If you look at the counterculture, it was really white privileged
Yeah, but
people
yeah,
speaking
but
in solidarity with the dispossessed and black culture. Look at jazz.
well, the counterculture in the 50s, you're thinking of like the Beats and stuff. These
Oh,
people
yeah.
divorced themselves from labor, which was a big mistake.
So I guess the
And
question is, and they were able to do that because there was a middle class to sustain them, right? I mean, is that because I don't know if there's a middle class anymore to
no,
sustain
it
that
was
kind of.
ideological in the sense that it was infected with American individualism rather than collectivism. So in many ways, I'm very critical of the Beats for this. I mean, my heroes go back to the turn of the 20th century. Mother Jones, these kinds of figures. I mean, you went to West Virginia with the miners. Mother Jones was a hero,
Right. I,
and
yeah.
the Beats, they were in enclaves like Greenwich Village and Haight Ashbury, and uh, they really removed themselves from the struggles of the working class and really didn't show much interest in it. And I found it self-absorbed. And then what triggered the upheavals of the '60s was the civil rights movement, but more importantly, the anti-war, the Vietnam War. And then we had this, but again, these movements were divorced from labor. This was the problem. So labor was in opposition. The traditional AFL-CIO, George Meany, these figures, they voted for Nixon.
Right.
So we have to rebuild a radical labor movement, and we have to make sure that we are allied with labor, and that the concerns of the precariat are our concerns. And that really wasn't true in the 50s, and it wasn't true even in the 60s. Indeed, there was a kind of disdain for the working class. And that was a terrible mistake.
I
Um,
wonder if that movement, though, when it comes to the beats and it comes to the culture of self in the way you're talking about it, uh, is a step in a process towards more radical inclusion of
no,
everybody else.
it wasn't, though. It didn't work that way. I mean, you could have figures, Ginsburg and others, who are radicals, but at the same time, they had no real relationship with the working class. This is if you are going to build a counter movement to authoritarianism, it can only be built out of the working class. That's it.
I agree. But I also think at the same time, I think that for an individual to recognize them wanting to save themselves and figuring out why they should save themselves, I do think it has the potential to be a stepping stone for attaching the multiplicity of human beings all together in a group. Sort
But
of in the same
but
way.
the Beats didn't. I mean, the
I'm
Beats.
just talking about it as I know the Beats didn't. I mean, I know that wasn't even their agenda. I'm just saying that these movements grow out of a perceived need or a perceived vacuum that it fills, and then we can learn something after the fact, and
Well,
then
the
utilize it
problem
in.
is that artists, intellectuals, writers, uh, who are divorced from the working class perceive the world through their own needs, which are and I mean that's one of the reasons I'm in the prisons. You want those as a writer. I want those relationships with those who are most persecuted within the society. I don't ever. It's why I was in Gaza. It's why I was in El Salvador. It was the Sudan. I mean, the list is endless. I always want to be grounded in the reality of those who are persecuted and forgotten. I mean, most of my students are black, of course, and really, really poor. So I think that this is why I love Orwell. This is very much Orwell. I mean, he writes Down and Out in Paris and London, Homage to Catalonia, where he's fighting in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists. He's actually almost killed. He's shot through the neck. So that's what I come out of. And Orwell, although, he went to Eton and spoke with an Etonian accent and, he cared and was conscious about the working class. And Wigan Pier. I mean, he goes up to the coal mines in Wigan Pier and writes that book. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I find that the counterculture in the 50s and the 60s, for me, was very self-centered and narcissistic. And I never related to it particularly. I went back to that older socialist tradition, both in terms of artists and in terms of, movements. The old Communist Party. I'm not a communist, but it was a very important element in sort of protecting the working class. I mean, when they do evictions in the 30s, the police would show up to cart the furniture out. Everybody would scream, "Go get the Reds, go get the Reds." And next thing you know, all these tough communist guys would go and carry the furniture back inside. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I absolutely appreciate that, and I have great affection for that time too. I would only say that when I my appreciation of the Beats is the same appreciation I have for any movement that attempts to deconstruct something and then attempt to reconstruct it in a way that might be more useful. Jazz does that to me. Like,
Well,
every
I
art
love
movement,
jazz, but I'm not going to have a whole discussion on the Beats. I don't know the Beats. I mean, you were right. You're right about the deconstructing,
right?
but the construction was, what were they constructing? That was the question I would ask.
Right. The
And
question is, yeah, they're
yeah,
wandering around. It's that adventurism of maybe nothing needs to be reconstructed. And again, I don't see that as a formula for success. I just think it's a curious thing to step into just for a reconsideration. I always think reconsiderations are really important to keep us honest and connected to what we should be doing and what we really feel. So much thinking is reflexive. I think a lot of people don't know
oh,
what they
most
believe
of
in.
it.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Most people speak in the cliches and they're given.
yeah. So any opportunity to challenge that, I think,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
good.
but I think the Beats had real limitations. I mean, as did I think even in the movements in the '60s.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh, these were people who were quite seamlessly integrated into the professional classes afterwards.
Yes, Jerry Rubin. My goodness gracious.
All of them,
What happened to
all of
that
them,
guy?
and
Yeah.
and uh,
We should have
and
started with the question
I
about the
think
beats.
what's that?
I said we should have started with the question about the beats.
Yeah, I wrote about them in Death of the Liberal Class.
Yes. Yes, which is a great book. Everybody should go get it. And so, to end, I think that we should say that your new book is out.
Right, on Gaza.
Genocide Foretold. So people should go and grab that. And you're going to be working on a new Gaza book with
That'll take us
Joe.
forever, but yeah,
That
well,
will
I mean,
take you.
that'll be reported.
Yes. All right. Well, beautiful.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks for the
Thanks.
conversation, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne.